Everybody for coming to another installment of the Game Dev Squad. Um, these are focused on giving each other an opportunity to kind of teach and discuss about a topic that we want to share and we think is really resourceful. And today we have Daphne discussing stylized substance designer textures. And with that being said, I will pass it over to you.
Hey, hi guys. Spooky is also coming to say hi. See, this is what I warned you about. She's gonna try and chill on my lap. But yeah, today we're gonna go over some substance designer stuff. Um, Mostly in like a stylized sense, just because I mean that's the work that I do. And one thing that I've noticed about learning designer, um, it's very, I guess like from if you want to get like a really quick material out. It's very easy to create a more realistic leaning tutorial or realistic leaning material as opposed to something more stylized. You have to kind of, I don't know, just kind of like sink into designer. It took me a hot minute to figure out how to kind of bend this software to my needs in the style that I wanted. So hopefully, the tips I'm going to tell you today help you get on that track a little faster than I did. Um, so I'm going to focus on kind of running through at first a couple of basic nodes that I use constantly. Um, and then we're going to go through this really easy moss material that I set up. And then we'll actually probably do like a demo. I'll ask you guys maybe a material and we'll make something based off of what y'all say. But
Ooh.
I figure that's just like the best way to learn. I mean, universally, when you get into a new program, I think the best way to learn it is just to kind of sink your teeth into it, right? Substance designer, even more so, especially if you've never messed with anything that is node-based before, um, just because it can be a little weird to wrap your head around. Um, and furthermore, when it comes to um, learning from tutorials, which is this is going to sound a little funny because this is a tutorial, but it can be kind of specifically for designer, it can be a bit bad to rely solely on tutorials, especially if you're not really familiar with the nodes or node-based thinking, because then you're relying on a specific set pattern of how to use these nodes, and you don't really learn how to use them in a different way or really how to use them out of order or you're being basically given the tools without being properly told what the tools even are. So we're gonna try and focus our thinking on what these specific nodes can do rather than, hey, let's make a, a brick texture. Because I think that's just a better way to learn, node based rather than material function based. Um, so we're gonna start with like these shape nodes over here. So well, first off, if you've never used Substance Designer before, um, you're always going to start with a new substance graph. You're going to be given a little like window pop up, and it's going to ask you like all the setting questions that you'd probably you get in Painter too. Things like resolution and whatnot. Um,
If you did
and
get a pop-up, we cannot see it. I
Oh
didn't
no,
mean to
no,
interrupt.
I'm not. No,
Okay,
I've
wonderful.
I've skipped past the pop up. But just to tell you what you would see, because it doesn't just open up to like it doesn't open up blank, which I kind of wish it did. But it's a little, it gives you like a bunch of stuff at first. Just pick your default settings and render pipeline that you're familiar with.
Hmm.
And then from here, I've kind of messed around with this a little bit, but basically what you're given off the bat is you're going to be given, let's actually set this up as to how it was, just so you can think about it that way. So you're given uh, your base color, normal, roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, and your height map. And all of this, like the combination of if this were all the maps you were using, right? This is kind of the best representation that designer can give you. Um, basically what your material is saying, right? Um, you can go on this little scene tab here, and you can actually change it to like a matte ball if you wanted. I prefer rounded cylinder, not for everything, but for most materials, that's kind of like the best way to see everything. Um, and then you've got your plane, right? Um, got rounded cube, got a lot of fun stuff in here. Um, it helps if like, if you're going to be using your material on a specific shape, that there's maybe a primitive for in here. It helps to see it that way. And then you're going to go from your materials tab to default. They changed this a little bit since the update, but I believe so. Adobe standard, and then let's go parallax occlusion, and then it gives you a bunch of these settings up here, which I'll be real, I don't really mess with these too much. What I'm looking for is your height scale. Um, so this can kind of, when you're working with height, this will actually, make it uh, work. Like let's say this was our height map, right? Let's see if it's at 1, so we're gonna need to go back. And then if you change scale of your height, or it should work. Figures they changed this on me at the last minute, but or it just might be hard to see. But that should be um, increasing the what's the term? I guess the um, I don't want to say dramaticness, but that's what my brain's going to. It changes the distance of your height to be more dramatic. For some reason, it's not wanting to budge right now, but usually it would be here. Maybe if we mess with tessellation instead. Okay, there we go. There we're talking. See, that's what I'm talking about. Not sure why I didn't want to use it the other way, but see how it's kind of like bending the cylinder to like your height map. It's gonna be more dramatic once we get all the other maps in there, but that's what that does. It can be a really nice like visual tool, even if you're not really playing with a height map. Um, it can kind of just um, help you see how your material is coming along as opposed to just on a flat surface. I don't like to rely on it too much because it can, um, if you use it too much, it can give you kind of an unrealistic expectation of what your material is going to look like, but that can be kind of nifty. Besides that, so you're given your base color, normal, roughness, and all the good stuff, right? Um, off the bat. And um, when it comes to texturing in general, I'm a very color-oriented artist. I like to immediately think of what is my color palette going to be, which is why designer was such a challenge for me in the first place, because you can't necessarily think like that off the bat. You actually have to start thinking in terms of black and white, because um, by building um, a nice layer of black and white, you can kind of, there are methods to sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Um, let's say if you're making a sand material, right? And you want to have like some rocks and some starfish on there too. Um, you want to start first by thinking, okay, how, how sandy is the sand? Or like, is it like nice like ridges, or is it like really, really smooth? Is this going to be like a really windy sand dunes and it's like thrown all over the place, or some really nice patterns? And then from there, let's say it's on the beach and you want to add some rocks, so you can create those rocks in Substance Designer and then add them to the sand, and then maybe you want a starfish in there too, why not? And then you create the starfish. We're going to go through methods of doing all of this, but what I'm trying to explain is that by thinking of your material in terms of layers of detail, you can not only create black and white maps that are more accurate to what you're looking for, but you can also then use those maps to create, um, you know, uh, color maps, to then have your base color and whatnot. So it's good to start with black and white first, because that's the least complicated way of thinking about everything. You have to be thinking about um, the black and white map in terms of roughness. Um, Metallic is a bit easy, but if you have elements of things that are and are not metallic in the same material, they have to think about that. And then, of course, uh, ambient occlusion, and then normal gets in there as well, and height if you're working with that. Um, so with that being said, we're going to start in the realm of no base color. So let's start with different nodes and how to use them. So when it comes to creating different shapes, these are the three different nodes that I like to use. So let's look on Polygon. So when you double click, first off, when you double click on a node, that kind of will light it up in like the base parameters, right? And you can start messing with it. And it also will show it in this little 2D viewer too, which can be super helpful. So from here we can start to like mess around. We want more sides, or maybe we want less sides. You can make it explode if you want. Um, and I think this will mess with, yeah, so you can make a, heck, you can make like a snowflake or something, right? So there's lots of these, every node has a certain list of parameters that you can use to create something. But when it comes to um, creating like shapes or patterns of shapes, these nodes can be really useful for getting something really quick and easy, especially if it's not really necessarily a complicated shape. Polygon 2 um, is kind of a similar thing. It's just um, not solid color, but you kind of get the same idea, right? Change the sides, all that good stuff. And then shape, uh, this is a bit uh, more complicated. Not that it is, but it's got a lot more stuff to it. So you can start with square or a disc, more a circle, but get the idea. Got more like a faded circle, um, a bell, which is more of a smaller circle. But yeah, there's lots of different things. This one's got like a point to it. Lots of different things that you can make specifically with this shape tool. Honestly, I prefer to use just the shape tool, unless I need something like a hexagon or something like that. That's what these ones tend to be better for. But let's say uh, we wanted to, let's make like a geometric tile. We'll start with that, right? So I'll take this, and I'll start to go through each node and like how I would work with it. So let's start with transformation 2D. So what this node does is it basically allows you to kind of like manipulate the node, while also, unless you mess with these parameters, keeping uh, the texture tileable. That's a really great use of designers that you don't really have to think too hard about whether or not this texture is going to tile or not. So it kind of removes that whole compartment. You don't need to think about that for the most part, as long as you're not messing with so many things. Um, so you can kind of like manipulate this shape, make it stretch it out. You can mess with like this is like axis offset right here. You can rotate it, things like that. Something that is really great about this node in particular is when you're trying to place, let's go back to like the rocks on the beach, the and the starfish example. If you say you want your little rocks and your starfish to be arranged in a particular way, this node is a really quick and easy resource for you to just be able to place something. Um, One good tip though, if you don't want things to tile like this, you can go over to tiling mode, go to absolute, and no tiling. So let's say I wanted to like stretch out this thing a bit more and just keep it as that. Now I can do that. Um, yeah. Um, all of these little parameters here are things that you can edit. I don't really mess with anything but output format, which we'll get into a bit later, and then tiling mode for this specific purpose. Um, but it's one thing to take away from this is that nodes are they're dependent on their parent node. So you got like this this child node right here, if you will, and this parent node. So if I were to leave this as it was, by default things are tiling. So I have to go in here and change the child to no tiling. Um, so that's something to keep in mind whenever you're doing something like that, or you need to change um, the settings of a node to not be so dependent on its parent. Okay. So then from here, let's see, put this in the middle. That will be our little shape. We can also, oh boy, we'll center it. Cool. So we'll go to Bevel first. Move this over here. So Bevel is kind of self-explanatory. It basically bevels the shape as close as you can get in like a 2D format, right? Um, so you see how instead of harsh line, now we got softer line, and it kind of looks like a bevel. Um, so you can change this on the type of bevel. I more often than not use round because angular always looks a little weird. You can mess with the smoothing to maybe make it a more smoother transition. But the most important aspect of this node is the distance because it can kind of affect what the bevel looks like. See, this is more of like a rounder edge to it, whereas if you bevel inward, this kind of gives you like these sharper lines. So those types of details are important to take into consideration because, if you want your, say again, we're making a geometric tile, if you want it to be very sharp like this, well, you don't want it to be this type of bevel, you want that type of bevel. And those little details really end up making a difference. And then you plug this into levels. Oh, something I also want to make a quick note about. There's going to be lots of quick notes if you haven't noticed, but there's lots of little tidbits to Substance Designer, which out of context might make one very confused. Um, so remember thinking about talking in black and white. So uh, black and white nodes are going to have this little gray uh, little extension. A little gray line means that they're in black and white or grayscale, if you will. Um, now, uh, anything that's orange, though, that's going to be a map that uses color. So, for example, something like this node, might look a little, I'm gonna move all this out of the way. Um, this means that the node can either input, yeah, color or grayscale image, but it's going to be dependent um, on what node is already plugged into it. So see, I've already plugged in a grayscale, so you're going to want another grayscale. Otherwise, things get weird. Um, and then something like an opacity mask obviously needs grayscale map, but it tells you what the output's going to be. That can be really helpful when you're working with new nodes, especially if you don't know exactly what they do. The input and output can kind of tell you like where you need to start and where you're going to be going, even without knowing necessarily what the node does. So that's very important. So let's see, back to levels. Levels probably very self-explanatory, especially if you've used Photoshop before, right? Kind of just messes with your highlights and lowlights. So I use this a lot with bevel. That's why I put it here because oftentimes my bevel can kind of get me halfway to the crisp edge that I want, or maybe the more rounded edge. But levels can really solidify where I want my highlights and shadows to fall. So you can make like maybe the top more crisp, or maybe this is like a really harsh highlight and I want that to be put down, things like, or vice versa. So that levels is honestly very useful, especially when you start to think about, layering your material, having that, you know, background sand, and then maybe it's like a stony sand, right? So then you have a bunch of like stones, and then on top of that you have even smaller stones. So levels could help. Let's say you have that background, and you have that midground, but the midground value uh, for your height map or whatnot is just way too light. then you can, take levels and tone it down a little bit. So that way you can successfully add, your smaller details. Okay. So from here, we have one of the most important nodes ever, which is the blend node. Um, what it does is kind of self-explanatory. It blends two things together, depending on a blending mode. And so on copy is just like you paste one image on top of the other, right? So if I were to go like 50%, it's like half one image, half the other. But then you got some other fun things like add. Add will usually, so you need a background image, right? And then you need the foreground image. Um, add usually, if this was like a darker, let's see, let's make it real nice and dark maybe. Let's go like this. Okay. So add, as you can see here, we're adding the lighter information from this to create a shape. And then subtract, kind of like the opposite. Um, oh yeah, I won't go through all of these, but a bunch of different blend nodes here. This is really, this is the node that is going to like marry your texture together, right? From those larger details to the smaller details. It's hard to think of a way that would not be possible if it were not for this node, for how would you add things together? Um, or take things away, for that matter. Um, let's see what I might want to do. So we'll have like a shape like that. Why not? I feel like we're going for like a honeycomb type of thing with this hypothetical material. One thing I do want to point out as well before we move forward is how to utilize this viewpoint to your advantage when you're trying to make an edit to something. So as we've discussed, double clicking on something that changes both the 2D view as well as the base, you get your whole base parameters thing going on. However, if you just click on one thing, so let's do it for blend, right? So we can just see all the blend. But if you click on one thing, let's say I wanted to go back in time and I was like, dang, that whatever I did with my levels was just the worst. So I want to see my levels parameters, but I need to keep focused on how those parameters are going to influence my material. So we can still see the material, as you can see in the 2D viewer, but we're looking at the levels and we're seeing how that input, how changing the input messes with the shape. So this is super important when you're trying to make very detailed or heck, just like large scale edits. Because if you had to, make a little edit, then double click to go back and see how it looks, then go back and forth, it would take forever, and you wouldn't be so hyper focused on exactly the change that you want to make because you're kind of just in the dark guessing. So 100% recommend this to get exactly what you need. Yeah, let's go like that. Why not? Okay. Okay, so we'll get back to, let's see, we'll get back to these notes later. No, don't want to do that. I just want to move you. Okay, cool. So when it comes to making a tileable pattern, you got two main options, right? These are the ones that I use. You have tile sampler and tile generator. For the most part, they do basically the same thing. However, each one has slightly different utilities. So let's see, pattern. Oh, that's a color one. Look, actually, see, some nodes have actually specific. Yeah, see, this node has one for grayscale and one for color. So obviously we need this grayscale version because we're in grayscale. Bye bye. Okay, cool. So we'll go with tile sampler first. So first you plug in your pattern input. You may be wondering, where is our pattern? It has been inputted, but that is because we have to change what we are telling it. Right now the pattern is square. We also have to change that to pattern input. And now we have a cool little pattern that we've made. So If you want a quick and easy pattern, this is definitely the way to do it. You can mess with how many different shapes are on each axis. You can mess with their rotation if you want it to be less uniform and more random. There's things like, I think this messes with the symmetry. I don't really use that one too often. We've got, you can mess with the size, specifically of an axis. Those are starting to look like rupees, which is kind of funny. Maybe we'll make a rupee material. I don't know.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
we can mess with the scale of everything, or you can make it more random. Um, position random. This is a great uh, little input that you can put into, let's say if you're trying to scatter some rocks and you want them to look as random as all heck, then you just use this. Because then they'll go everywhere. Then offset, we'll slightly offset things. Let's see what else we got. Yeah, rotation random. It's all kind of self-explanatory, but they're all fun nodes to um, help make uh, your pattern or your non-pattern, if you're trying to not make it look so uniform, work. Um, Mask random will randomly mask things out of your scene. You can also invert the mask. Let's see. Color random. Oh, this is a great one if you're trying to um, well, one, if you want the tint of uh, your objects to be slightly different, or you want the height to be different. It depends on specifically what your map is doing for you. But this is a great tool to kind of get some variation. Um, and yeah, so there's a lot to this tile sampler node. Um, Tile generator, so we'll plug that in. All right, go all the way up. Change it to image input. So for the most part, you have very similar settings. Um, let's see, but there are some slight differences. Like you have, I think that's pronounced interstice. I did not know the term until using this program. And this messes with the spacing between objects. Um, And honestly, if it weren't for these specific sizing tools, I would probably use Tile Sampler all the time. However, Tile Generator is really, really great when you're using uh, when you're trying to make a brick material, because this little doodad right here can help you like squish and squash your bricks to exactly where they need to be, so there's no weird like gigantic spacing. It's great. It fixes all of your problems whenever it comes to trying to like lodge bricks together um, and stuff like that. But for the most part, um, eh, this generator is pretty much the same. There are a bunch of uh, different options here that you can kind of explore, but for the sake of time, we're going to move on from this one. We have kind of come up with like a rupee thing here. I love that. Okay, cool. So, let's see. How do I want to do this? Let's go. We'll get into these. Get. Um, I'll use this one and that one. We'll get into these later as well. Okay, cool. And then we'll do these ones later too. Okay. I know how to want to structure this now. Okay, cool. So let's say, let's go back to this one. Let's try and make like a uh, honeycomb or some sort of, I'm getting like sequins out of this, right? Okay, cool. So let's go all the way down to color random and mess with that a little bit. And then, okay. Let's say if you wanted to add like a gradient onto things, which can be Very helpful. Of course, you'd use the blend tool. And you add this as, whoopsie, you add that as your foreground, not both. Alright, cool. So you can get a nice like gradient on this, or if you want it the opposite way. This is really great for when you're making like individual blades of grass to help them like blend. Um, then combining those blades into like a huge material, like say using tile sampler, like inputting those blades of grass as like a bunch of different pattern inputs. Um, Having like a gradient on it like gives it more depth than it just being like a blade of grass that you just slapped on a sign. Um, so here's like one way to add that sort of thing to a node. Let's see, what else do I want to do? Uh, let's explore how this would look. Okay, cool. So this is the part if you were, say, quote unquote, finished with your material, not that you are, but you want to start thinking about color, where you'd add it to a gradient map. And what a gradient does, if oh, editor is on my different monitor, cool, is it gives you, it will take your black and white map and basically um, plot points along that map, and you can manipulate those points to represent different colors. So say I wanted my black values to be red and my white values to be blue. It will come up with a gradient map that represents that. So you can also use this map or this node to uh, quickly color your material. And one fun thing, if you're trying to, say, stick to a particular color palette, you can use pick gradient and then sample a gradient. It'll come up with all those colors. Usually you have to go back and manipulate them to get the colors that you want. And this one gave me a bunch of colors for some reason. But if you're trying to specifically color match to something, this can be very beneficial. Let's see. But yeah, this is why it's good to get like a really in-depth black and white uh, what's the term? Uh, Image, because so your texture at first, because otherwise it can be really hard to mess with the different values on your grayscale when you don't have that detail. Um, but yeah, that's basically what it might do. And let's say you were really, really happy with that. You could then plug this into, of course it's all over here, right? Plug this into your base color. And then that will be reflected on your material. One important thing to note as well is when it comes to color maps in particular, you have to change the output format. Great. Change it to absolute and it'll be then 8 bits per channel. Um, I swear it used to be like this on default, but for whatever reason they changed it. Basically what will happen if it's the wrong output, um, your color map is going to look very washed out in Unreal. Um, and give you a headache, and you'll be like messing with it in Photoshop. Be like, why does it look all washed out? It's because the output's funky. And then let's see. If you wanted to then say make a normal map for this, you could plug in uh, your quote unquote height map and then get a normal map out of it, which you can then mess with the surface size and the height depth to kind of get the normal map that you want. Let's plug this in. Huzzah, normal map. Maybe make it, let's see, less or more, um, uh, I guess, noticeable, depending on what you want for your map. And then everything else is kind of self-explanatory, well, at least. Let's see, we got, let's grab this. This is just a uniform color node, by the way. It's basically just a node where you can either assign it a grayscale um, tone or a color tone, depending on what it is assigned as. Um, so if you put white in metallic, it becomes metallic. Fun. Um, okay. And then another thing you can do, I'm not gonna mess with curvature at the moment, but you can also get from your black and white map your a map for ambient occlusion with this ambient occlusion map. And then you plug that into, and you'll add AO. Um, if you needed a curvature map for whatever reason, um, you can also plug in a normal and it'll shoot out a curvature map. That's just good to know. And then height, this could also be used as a height map, so you just plug it in, and then see it'll uh, like project that height map onto your primitive, depending on like the lightest value being the most in your face and the darkest value being more in the background. So that can be really, really fun to mess with. But for the most part, that is kind of how you plug in um, uh, you go from your grayscale to then your specific color maps and then use grayscale in terms of thinking with your grayscale maps. I'm gonna kind of pivot away from this random little material that we've made to talk about something that I was working on and talk about some notes that we haven't yet. So let us, okay, let us plug these back in to kind of clear thing. Oh, is that already in it? Okay, cool. Okay, okay, cool. All right. So I was working on this moss material, mostly for the heck of it. Um, and I kind of wanted to show you my line of thinking in terms of making a stylized material. Um, something just like really, really simple too. Let's see. I need this. Plug that into the roughness. And then this goes in ambient occlusion. Cool. And I believe this goes into height. Okay, fun, fun, fun. Okay, cool. So this is kind of like a hand-painted moss, if you will, right? Um, the specific style that I like to do the most is like I call it a painter fell asleep and the paints went everywhere. That's at least how I like to texture things. Um, and if you really wanted sort of like a look like this, it's always nice to start out with clouds too is really, really great. And then mess around with slope blur, which if you've messed around in Substance Painter with the different filters and whatnot, you'd know that slope blur is really, really great at giving like a faux like brush stroke type of thing. So this is like a similar gimmick, if you will. So uh, let's see. So I plugged in my clouds both into grayscale and the slope, which you can im uh, import different images. And then it starts off with samples actually being, I believe, at 0. Um, but you actually want your samples up all the way, just kind of get the best result. And then you can mess with the intensity of the said slope blur. And it already, I really like this, as you can see, because you get those like nice chunky shapes. So you go from something that's, very, say, realistic dust cloud to something much more abstract. Heck, this could honestly be, you could go from here, not necessarily moss, but you can make like a really fluffy cloud texture from this. I've used this in the similar manner to make like a hand-painted dirt or even snow. Um, but then from here, we go to directional warp. Directional warp, when used in slope blur, trying to like layer down like a stylized material, right? It just helps add some variation. Let's see, without and then with. It kind of just starts to manipulate everything a little bit, not keep it like as samey, and then plugging that into a directional blur just a little bit. Um, it kind of see it kind of like muddles everything up, so it's not as like sharp. And then we plug that into our gradient map here, using more like a cooler tone dark and a lighter tone highlight. Um, so this is like a really basic stylized material, but you can see you don't really have to do like these complicated maps to get like a pretty fun looking result. Um, and then from your directional blur, we can get um, a height map, of course. Plug that in. And when it comes to like hand painted materials, or quote unquote hand painted materials like this, I like a really slight normal map. Something that will help give it an edge, right? But not something that's going to, um, let's see, like completely like that. That doesn't look so nice. But if we just soften it a little bit, it gives a really nice result. And then did the same thing with ambient occlusion, right? I think it started out, yeah, something like this. Now that doesn't look very, very nice. So if we tone it down a little bit, we can get just enough AO to help differentiate, because this is it without, if you like the softer look, maybe, but this helps add just a touch of definition so that not everything is really lost. And so going back to, using nodes for different things, right? I went through and mess with levels just a little bit, just because personally, I feel like I know the levels node very well, and I know I wanted a little bit of a lighter result than the darker result I got out of AO. So I just use that node because I know it very well, and that way I can get that lighter ambient occlusion map that I'm looking for. So that's just one example of how to use, I guess, nodes that you really, really like, right? Let's see. Let's see. We went over all of these. Um, let's see. I'm gonna leave most of these maybe to a part two of this, but something to note. Did I talk about blur? Okay, I don't think I did. So, one thing, um, part 26 of things to note, is that I find there are a couple different blurs, right? You actually got your, oh, don't want them connected. You got your quote unquote regular blur here, and then um, a blur HQ. I find if, let's say I wanted to blur the heck out of this, right? I find that this will give you a much better result than just blur. So we put it through just blur. It will undoubtedly blur it. However, I don't know. I feel like I can always get like a blurrier result out of Blur HQ, but then if I only want a little, just a touch of blur, I can also get that the more fine edges of what I want out of Blur HQ. Blur seems to kind of just be like a you want all or nothing sort of deal. So not that it's a bad node, but I just find I get better results out of this guy than that guy. So just something to consider and play around with. Not that we want our things to be blurry. There we go. Um, let's see. Some more just navigational stuff. I don't really think we have time to kind of go into a audience poll of hey, what material do you want to make? We'll do that maybe next time. Um, but just some things if you should know. If you uh, tap spacebar, this brings down this kind of little selection menu of all these different nodes. So you got like common ones that you use, right? Like gradient map, blend, and blurs and stuff like that. So this is like a great way to be like, oh, I haven't worked with sharpen before. Let's see what that does. You know what I mean? And that's like half the fun, and half the trials of working with this program. But then this is also a great way, besides your library, to look for something specific. Like let's say we want a noise. So it will recommend you, say, nodes that are specifically noise, and then things that are known to be noises, like crystal. You could use that for noise, you know? So instead of saying using clouds 2 for the input of the slope, I could have used this. And then you get a wildly different result, right? So heck, these look like paint strokes, which is really fun. So just that different map can create, uh, you know, can change something so drastically, right? Um, so that's something I really want to emphasize. Exploration, if all else. Um, but yeah, so cells are fun. Got a bunch of different maps like that. Again, if you've messed with Substance Painter a lot, you know that these are also in there. Like what does that do? Oh, cool. Not really what I'm looking for. Maybe you want to make like a turtle's back. That'd be a little turtle back shell, maybe. But yeah. See, even if I put this in directional warp, it'll change based off of that, right? Let's see, anything else I wanted to go over real quick? Um, so I guess in terms of um, keeping things more on like a stylized level, slope blur is your best buddy. Um, and I would definitely, when it comes to the gradient map, if you're trying to stay to a specific, like really stylized color palette, that pick gradient buddy is going to really help you out so that if you have a reference of the colors you want to use, you can just say go and drag and now you have the colors. Granted, wow, see, fun result. Granted, now it's you're gonna have to organize this a little bit, but um, yeah, this just goes to show how much color maps are so important because now this looks like a crystal geode of some kind. Um, but yeah, and then when it comes to things like your AO, your normal maps, um, keep them light and tasteful because if you go really crazy with those, you're gonna get a really crazy result and not necessarily like the light stylized fluffiness if you're into that like I am that you really want out of this program. And when you're ready to export everything, after double checking that your inputs are correct, see this wasn't. There you go, now it see you want the 8, not the 16. You're gonna go to this little wrench right here, export those outputs, and this is where you can kind of export everything. If you need the format in something specific, you can get that here, but by default it's a PNG. And then you can name it. Like usually I go off with the graph and I just go like Hamas, and then it'll create said map with the suffix. Um, and I always use everything save. Well, I don't necessarily need metallic, but I need everything else, and you just pick where you want this to go. So I'll put this in my 3D objects folder, and you export those outputs, and usually it goes very quickly. Um, and then you're done. And that's also really great because you can actually, heck, if you wanted to, and if your computer won't puke out its guts like my laptop will, you can uh, have it set to automatic export when outputs change. So that way you don't need to remember like, oh, hey, I've made a million edits since I edited, edited this texture last. And it'll just kind of do it for you. So that way you can kind of fill to your heart's content any day of the week. You don't have to really worry about it. But yeah. So that is basically it for now. Like I said, I'll probably do a part 2 to this because there's a lot more to explore with this program, but I really encourage you to mess around with it because it can be really daunting and really, really confusing. Um, Again, especially if you've never really done something node-based before. But really just break it down into um, your black and white maps, you know, that grayscale. Think about what that means for your, what does white to dark mean for roughness? What does that mean for height? And just take it one step at a time and focus on one map at a time. Because if you start to, off the bat, think of the material as a whole and not dissect it into those 6 or 5 or different parts, then it's going to be harder to envision what necessarily you need out of, you know, your grayscale and then your color map. Um, but yeah, that's going to be all from me for today. So if we have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Excuse me. Awesome. That was really that I appreciate how you broke that down just because I feel like that you can never really find a tutorial or a video on somebody kind of talking about what an individual node does versus like a time lapse of like 3 hours worth of work in 10
Yeah.
minutes.
Usually, yeah, you don't want to get in the habit of, I mean, time lapses are great. It's really cool to like see, type of results someone can get. However, if you're just stopping and pausing the time lapse, you're just being like, okay, what number did he input into this
Literally.
parameter, and what node is this? And that's all you're focusing on. You're not focusing on the learning. So, 100% recommend. Granted, we're two-thirds into it, but taking part in the club's materials challenge, that's how I learned this program. Because
Yeah.
tutorials are great, and I honestly think going on ArtStation and seeing maps, like, little map like this is actually better, because that way you can just see like what they did and then try it out for yourself without, getting your head stuck in all of these base parameters here. But yeah, I really recommend doing something like materials, just because that's really gonna force you to learn and grow with this program. And you can get some really nice results out of just a really simple tree, so you never know. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Eli actually did have a question in the
Mhm.
chat. They said, "Do you think you could use Designer to make a sub UV map?"
Define sub UV. I'm not particularly familiar with that.
I
Yeah.
believe. Oh, go ahead, Eli.
Oh,
You're
sorry.
gonna be way better at than I
Yeah.
would be.
Yeah, but with the because the sub UV is like red for particle systems with like the moving
Oh, okay.
fog and stuff. It's like the flipbook animation, I think, is like a better term
Yeah.
for it. But
Right, right. And,
yeah,
um,
I didn't know if using like the tiling system would be a good way to do some of that procedural stuff because like I don't want to hand paint fog. It's not.
right, right, right. I would imagine you could. I don't really mess around with like particles stuff and whatnot, but I bet you definitely could. I've seen some crazy people do some really cool VFX stuff using Substance Designer. So yeah,
Nice.
I'm not, but I would be surprised if it wasn't possible. So
Mhm.
I'm not really sure how I would go about doing that.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Mhm.
Ooh, I'm definitely gonna be thinking about that. That's an interesting question. I suppose I think you should be able to, but Eli, if I think of something, I'll message you because that's a really I'm gonna be thinking about that one. But a question I actually had was,
Mhm.
do you at all use like any textures outside of Substance Designer, or do you specifically stay within the program? Like, if you're like, oh, I want this, like, I want to use this foliage, just beautiful foliage I've
Mhm.
created, and I want to use it in Designer, and I don't want to have to make it through shapes, like, and I'm just gonna use this mask or whatever. Like, have you done that,
Right.
or do you suggest doing
Hun-
that?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it'd be for someone who hasn't messed with this program before. I actually wanted to go over that today. However, it's kind of, if you've never messed around with Designer before, I didn't want to like throw that on you as well. But yeah, 100%. Like when it comes to like for instance, making like a brick wall texture, I always sculpt my bricks in ZBrush, and then ZBrush can let you like take like a specific screenshot. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but I'll actually drop a tutorial in the Discord that actually kind of covers how to do this. But you create almost like a height map screenshot of your brick, and then import each individual brick as like a square in Designer, and then you can go about using your tile generator to create that brick wall, and it'll have your really nice detailed or stylized bricks in there, rather than trying to mess around for hours with the shape tool. Because I'll be honest, I'm not really the best at creating like those specific shapes in Designer, so I'll always either go like the ZBrush sculpt route, then import it in, or like if I want to make a specific like decorative alpha, then I'll paint it in Photoshop, then import it in here. If you ever wanted to do that, um, you go to your specific graph and right click, and then import, and then bitmap, and then let's see. See, I have some ornamental alphas that I've purchased. I wanted to do this one. It'll import it, and then go to resources, drag it in. So there it is. And then just sometimes it'll import it as a color. So just make sure it's on grayscale, and then you can just mess around with that. So yeah, I 100% recommend doing that. Just because if you really need something this specific, like I am not advanced enough in designer to know how to make this specific shape. So, but I know how to do it in Photoshop, so I'll just quickly make that up and add it in here. So yeah, I 100% advise that workflow if that's something you're comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, if anybody else has any questions, I'm sure Daphne would be more than happy if you reached out to her.
Oh,
But
sweet.
that was a really great presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time to put this together and
Yeah, no problem.
demo for us. Yeah. So, hopefully we get to around part two.
Yes, sometime this summer. I
Oh.
will definitely want to do that because there's so much in this program I want to talk about. It's a fun place once you get used to it.